Welcome to the Phoenix Prosperity Podcast, where wealth meets legacy. Join your host, Tim Fergestad, as we explore the journeys of Phoenix's finest to success and beyond.
Hello, this is Tim Fergestad. Thank you for joining us. My guest today is Dr. Justin West, a board-certified plastic surgeon and president and co-founder of the KCNT1 Epilepsy Foundation. After his son Andrew was diagnosed with ultra-rare KCNT1 epilepsy, Justin stepped into global advocacy, drug development, and precision medicine, working alongside groups like Praxis Precision Medicines to accelerate real solutions for families worldwide. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right, so that was a very small snippet. You've done all sorts of incredible work. Maybe it'd be easiest to start off with a sort of a snapshot of how you got started in medicine, and then we can move forward.
Well, there's a long story there. I guess I can try to keep it shortish. So my father was a surgeon and my mother was an OR room nurse. So I grew up in a house that sort of spoke medicine at the table. And my dad was kind of one of these legendary characters. You know, my dad, the trauma system that we all benefit from in this country, you know, where you get, you know, in a car accident and they take you to hospital and save your life when you have no business being alive after, that entire system was basically built by my father and a group of people that he put together. So there's a long, interesting story there. But, you know, I saw him do that. I used to go around, you know, the country with him speaking about trauma all over the place. And I just found what he did really compelling. And he loved his job. And I think that there's something about finding somebody who loves what they do for a living is really compelling, right? If my dad had been the happiest, you know, guy doing, you know, recycling, you know, or doing waste management, I would have probably done that thing because he loved his job. And I mean, he loved it so much. I would go in high school in the middle of the night and go do cases with him. You know, we started dissecting you know, we had access to one of these catalogs that you could get like in junior high and high school to do like, you know, frog dissections or shark dissections. So I was doing that stuff at home and I just always liked what he did. So he was one of these very open kind of minded people, taught me everything that I was interested in and never forced it down her throat. I had a brother who could not have been less interested in medicine. And so he never went down that path. But because I was interested, he kind of showed me whatever I was willing to, to learn. So he took me to the hospital. We'd go on rounds. I go to the operating room. You know, then I started working in a research lab at UCI under this really famous guy who developed this really critical system that's used to this day. I put my first rabbit on bypass when I was 18 years old. So surgery's kind of been in my blood since I was, I guess, a kid. There was never any question about whether or not I would go into medicine. I think the only question is what kind of surgeon would I become? And ultimately, I chose a different path for a variety of reasons. But that's, I guess, the origin story about why medicine.
Okay. And surgery makes sense too, right? Plastic was a natural fit.
Well, you know, I think you have to decide like what resonates, right? So when I went to medical school, I loved my dad's stories about trauma the most. I mean, he would come home and talk about someone who they dragged into the ER who had been shot, you know, and then they took a saw, cracked the chest open, put his hand inside that chest and pumped the heart while he straddled the gurney on the way to the OR and saved a life.
Right.
And I thought, I want to do that. I'm, you know, a bit of an adrenaline junkie and I like the
Yeah.
idea. You know, like there's nothing more powerful than saying no to death. And I thought that's a pretty cool thing to do. But when I went to med school, by the time I got there, you know, things were changing in the healthcare system. You know, reimbursement was changing a lot and malpractice rates were going through the roof. And I found that a lot of the general surgeons that when I was in med school that were ahead of me in the ladder and that would ultimately be training people like me were really kind of bitter about their jobs. And I thought, wow, this is nothing like the enthusiasm that I saw in my father. And you know, med school, you go through a bunch of different rotations, some of which are core. You have to do pediatrics, you have to do internal medicine, you have to do general surgery, and then you have a series of electives. And the electives I ended up doing were orthopedic surgery, ENT, and I had to pick a third, and I did plastic surgery, having zero interest in it. And then I did my first case, and what resonated immediately was this. I'm a creative person. I like writing. I like building. I like tinkering. I've invented a few products and worked with patent attorneys. And what the interesting thing about plastic surgery to me was we put things together, right? So general
Hmm.
surgery, like, if you've got appendicitis, you take it out. If you've got breast cancer, you take it out. It's more about taking things apart. And I will say, and I love teasing my dad about this, I don't know anything about cars, but I could walk outside with the right set of tools and in 7 days take apart my car very easily. I could never put it back together and make it work. So there's something that to me that's more complicated and interesting about building than taking apart, right?
Okay, sure.
So I liked the idea of restoration and giving people something back and the complexity that goes into planning a procedure to rebuild somebody. When I say that, I'm not talking about facelifts. I'm talking about breast reconstruction specifically. So I
Okay.
went into this case. This person had lost their breast from breast cancer, and we did this really complicated thing where we took the skin and fat from this woman's belly, and we did a microvascular procedure where we reconnected it to vessels in their chest and rebuilt a breast. I mean, it's very technical surgery, but it's very rewarding. It felt like putting somebody back together and making them whole. So that really resonated with me. I liked creative problem solving.
Okay, sure. I totally understand that. I recently reread Psycho-Cybernetics. Do you know that book?
No, it sounds
Oh,
interesting though.
it's old. It's by Maxwell Maltz, I think. He was a surgeon about 100 years ago. Plastics partly too, later because the field was pretty young, and it was there's some interesting parts in there. It's a super famous book, but just about. I mean, because taking things out, right? You boom, you take somebody's cancer out, voila, I changed your life or I saved your life, sort of thing, can be very impactful. But the impact that you can have with subtle things on other people's lives with plastics and stuff can be crazy strong, right? And that's kind of
Yeah.
why he got into that whole field was is there were people who it was the story they were telling themselves, like, oh, I need a nose job or something. And they're like, your
Yeah.
nose is fine, but if it helps you, right? And it was like when it mattered, when it didn't, but things that did really impact their job or their life and stuff. And so anyway, just some pretty interesting and impactful stuff in that book. But
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, I think people tend to think of us as the idiot they see on TV driving a Ferrari, from some TV show. And there's a bunch of them that are like that, where, they're doing facelifts and they think of us as being kind of goofballs. Um, the origin for plastic surgery is far more interesting, right? I mean, you reference noses. Plastic surgery kind of was born in war, right? These people would, whether it was dueling or going to war, people would get these
right,
disfiguring injuries that would cause them to become social pariahs.
right,
And people looked at these and they said, huh, I wonder if I could make you more socially acceptable so that you don't have to hide at home and not be
right.
able to work and not take care of your children. And so it didn't originate as a, can I make this pretty person prettier? It was,
And
can
yeah, an
I
extra
take this person
5% prettier, right?
yeah, can I take this person, whether it's a cleft lip? In some cultures, when a mother has a child with a cleft lip, they are pushed out of their culture. They are pushed out of their community. So there's the procedures like that are deeply impactful. We also do really fascinating things. The most interesting case I've still done in my career, and I'll never be able to top it, was this 27-hour twin separation. We had these conjoined twins in DC where I trained at Georgetown, and we were part of a 7 surgeon team separation, and we were the ones that ultimately put these giant wounds back together so that they could live. And then the other interesting thing that nobody knows about, one of the only, and if not the only, Nobel Prizes in surgery is to a plastic surgeon. Plastic surgeon got the Nobel Prize for performing the first kidney transplant. The first solid organ transplant done on a human was done by a plastic surgeon. They not only figured out the technical side of it, but they also helped on the immunosuppression side. So, you tend to get very smart people who are very good problem solvers who go into it. I mean, there's a gating function, right? I mean, the thing that I do is one of the highest reimbursing things that you can do in medicine, which means by default, it's one of the hardest jobs to get. So you get some of the smartest people
Right.
going into this field, and so you get these very thoughtful, aggressive problem solvers. We're not many of whom give up that side of their brain and do the silly high reimbursing, cosmetic stuff. But that is part of who we are. And, quite frankly, not to transition, but it's that aggressive problem solving that really came in really handy when life changed for me. And my
Right.
son got diagnosed, and then my brother got diagnosed with a disease that we can talk about. So, I think of it, this our field is a problem-solving field, and I think
Right.
the only question is, do you do something really impactful, or you do something that lines your wallet and pays your kids college, and maybe you can do both. I don't know.
Right. I think, but to your point, it's a little next level because you have to reconstruct and rebuild and be creative
Yeah,
in that sense.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
okay.
Every
You
case is a
mentioned,
bit different.
right, right.
Yeah,
I want to circle back because you mentioned dueling, which was
yeah,
a deep pull. He mentioned that in that book too, and it was again the story because they were like these German duelists who they were proud of the scars they would get, and they
yes,
didn't, right? Versus the people who
yeah.
would found them
Well,
bad. It
there's
was kind of again the story you tell yourself. Breasts are
same way.
another
So
example in the book. Sorry, is they were doing breast reductions in the 20s. And it
yeah.
wasn't until the technology came around, then everybody flipped their mind, and now they wanted more curves, sort of thing. It was
Well, I probably still do more reductions than I do augmentations, right? I mean, one is very functional when a woman comes in who's had 20 years of back pain, neck pain, grooves in her
sure,
shoulders from these, shoulder stuff, or they're getting rash under the breast. I mean, that is a transformative, and it has one of the highest satisfaction rates of anything we do in plastic surgery, quite frankly. Breast augmentation, kind of a different story, right? It's women who kind of want to feel more feminine, more confident in their clothes. And it almost always comes down to, I want to fit into my clothes better. It's not, I want to look like that, model I saw at a bikini on Instagram, although sometimes that's their inspiration. But really, sometimes it's clothes. So I still, it's still very common today. But yeah, your dueling, point, like there are scars that I think, especially in particular in men, we're like, yeah, I'm kind of cool with that, right? It looks like you've been
right.
around a little
Yeah,
bit.
you
It
earned
gives you
it.
some character. I've got one that goes from here to here from a terracotta pot that I pulled down on my face, and
Oh, geez.
I've had three people in my life ever call it out, including one plastic surgeon, and interestingly, a Homeland Security officer because they recognize people by scars and tattoos.
Oh,
So
wow.
I used to play this game where when people would come in and say, "Well, I'm afraid of doing the surgery because of the scar," and I'd say, "Okay, we've been talking now for about 30 minutes face to face. Where's the scar on my face? I'll do your surgery for free if you can find it." No one ever finds it, but this Homeland Security guy says it's right above your lip, and I said, "How'd you know?" He said, "The minute I walked in the door, I cataloged your face to see where were your." He's like, "I do it by default," so I had to
Huh.
stop doing that challenge. But the dueling thing was when these guys would and forget pistols, when they would do swords,
Hmm.
sometimes they would get a chunk of their nose cut off. And when you've got a hole where it shouldn't be, much more socially disturbing, right? And so
Right, right,
some of the very early plastic surgery procedures were actually rebuilding noses for these guys who had been on the wrong end of a duel.
right. Yikes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and again, incredibly impactful stuff, and in its own right, in different ways. But you've shifted and making an impact in other ways as well now. Can you take us back to maybe when your son was diagnosed and
Sure,
how that
yeah.
changed the trajectory of your career and life?
Yeah, so Andrew was born in April of 2017, our third child. And when Andrew was born, he's this beautiful kid. And, he was born at Hoag Hospital in Newport Beach. And we were in this ocean view, recovery room. I thought, oh my God, I'm like the luckiest dad. I've got three healthy kids. And, like I'm able to take care of them, stably. And, it was a lot of work. We're older parents. Like we started late because, we're both
Yep,
doctors and med school
us
delays
too.
everything. And
Yep.
yeah, and so you delay, right? Because you don't have time as a med student. You don't have time or money as a resident. And then, and then we kind of struggled to conceive our first kid. So we had this like
Yep.
big delay. And so by the time Andrew came, I was like 41 years old. And but I thought, okay, I can do this. Like we both got good jobs. We can take care of these kids. And then when he was about 4 months old, my wife texted me and she's like, Andrew's doing something funny. Can you look at this video? And I looked at it and she said, look at his foot. And I looked at it and I was like, I don't see anything. And so I came home from work and he did it again. It was this tiny little subtle foot flicker. And I was like, well, maybe that's just chaotic baby movement. Like
Movement. Yeah.
I but she posted it on Facebook in this women's physicians group. And within about an hour, an epilepsy specialist in Orange County said, hey, that's a seizure. Take him to the hospital. So we took him in, and he went through the full workup, got a spinal tap and all these things, and you're watching your little baby because my other kids have been totally healthy. They've never needed anything. We hadn't been doing, they had never been doing ER, and he's being poked and prodded, and it was kind of miserable to watch. And he ended up getting admitted, and he ended up having, he had he had an EEG from the time that he got admitted, and he had like one or two more seizures. They said, okay, well, he's definitely having seizures. And by definition, once you have more than one seizure, you've got an epilepsy diagnosis.
Yep.
Like, oh shit, we got this kid who's got epilepsy. And I had never seen a seizure in my life. I had seen everything else, every version of bleeding and trauma
Right.
and near-death experience. I'd never seen a seizure except what you see on TV, which is really usually
Right.
poorly portrayed, right? You see these
What they,
general, huge like grand mal
but,
seizures.
right.
And but what they kept saying is, oh, it'll be fine. We'll find a drug, be fine. Well, the problem is it wasn't. So he didn't respond to the first drug, so then they switched it. Didn't respond to the second drug, so they switched it. And at some point, instead of switching drugs, they started adding drugs. Well, once you're on your fourth drug, or you're on a two or three drug combo, now you have, by definition, drug resistant epilepsy.
Hmm.
And the stats around that are bad. If you don't get controlled in your first one or two drugs, the odds of you getting control are pretty low. And he was, that first year, Andrew probably spent 100 days at various hospitals throughout Southern California, and nobody could come up with a diagnosis, but they kept saying, oh, he'll be fine. He'll grow out of this. He'll be fine. And so we started looking things up and said, well, could this be a genetic epilepsy? And a lot of the people kept saying, "Oh, he's too normal looking to have genetic epilepsy." And as a plastic
Huh.
surgeon, I know that has a very specific meaning to me because as you know, there
Hmm.
are disorders where they have abnormal faces, where the facial features tell you there is something genetic going on. So, abnormal face plus seizures much more likely to be genetic.
Right.
But there are plenty of diseases where your kid looks totally normal and has
Right.
something very wrong going on. So it took
Sure.
months to convince them to get that. And
I
then when
guess
he was seven,
so just I guess for listeners, just for
yeah,
context, maybe I think the numbers are like 1 in 10 people will have a seizure in their lifetime, but
yeah,
like 1 in 10 of those will go on to have repeated seizures or like an
yeah.
epilepsy condition. But um, young and old are sort of you're much more likely to have them when you're young, and then it kind of the likelihood of seizures, and which is why they say I think a lot of people grow out of it, right? Because there are things like infantile or febrile seizures and other things that they
Yeah.
manage to get up, and then as you get older, the incidence of seizures comes back. But um,
Yeah, and there's a whole range of reasons why people can get them. It can be trauma. As kids under
right,
6 months old get febrile seizures. Eventually grow out of that, and when you get fevers, you don't have seizures. You can get them from tumors. There's a wide spectrum of things that can cause it. But when you've got drug resistant epilepsy is different, right? There's lots of adults who are CEOs of major companies who are super high functional. They might have one seizure every 5 years, and not to be disrespectful, but I usually call those seizures of like inconvenience because they're having a very normal life now. The scary moment is if God forbid, they have a seizure while they're driving home. And I have
sure,
now friends that I've become deeply connected to the epilepsy community. And
okay,
you do. I've got a very good friend who is one of our scientists working on our disease, but also happens to have epilepsy. And he had a seizure in a car and nearly died. So,
oh,
all epilepsy is serious. But a kid like
sure,
Andrew, who can have anywhere from 20 to 100 seizures in a day, is unequivocally
wow,
different from that person who might have one every few
right,
years. So
and
drug resistant is very scary, and the
it is. And
genetic
the other,
epilepsies are very tough.
yes, and the other thing I was going to say is they can snowball, right? They can be progressive. That
Yeah.
the frequency and the duration of seizures can increase the frequency of future ones, depending
Yeah.
upon the type.
Yeah. And
So
then
so managing it right away is really important. Yeah.
the horrible thing for us is, we always refer to his disease as an epilepsy disorder. Everybody does. But it's one of the like 10 diagnoses that he has as a result of this. And the most profound thing is the lack of development. So Andrew is 8, but is essentially a functional 6-month old. So my child
Oh wow.
downstairs is wheelchair dependent. He is 100% dependent on us. We feed him. Most kids like Andrew actually are tube fed, but Andrew fortunately has enough functional that he can swallow. But he's 8. I've never heard his voice. I've never seen him take a step. We're raising chronically a baby. He is in diapers.
Right.
My son is 8 and I'm 52 and I'm still changing, diapers every day. And unless we fix this disease, I will never hear his voice. I will never see him walk. And we will be taking care of this ever growing child as we age and get older and weaker and eventually end up in diapers ourselves. We're gonna have three people in this house. I mean, it's the future when you look down the road. This disease, if it never doesn't get solved, it's a devastating, destructive disease, not just for the kid, but for the entire family. For the
Right.
parents, for the siblings, for my parents, I mean, for the neighbors. I mean, I think of it like a nuclear bomb, right? I mean, there's the initial blast that kills you, and then there's the radiation, and then there's the fire. I mean, it just goes on and on and on how much this disease and there's 700 genetic epilepsies like this that are not nearly as catastrophic. I mean, he happens to have, unfortunately, one of the worst genetic epilepsies, but there's hundreds of them, and there's families out there
Right.
that nobody's ever met who on the exterior live these normal lives. I mean, most of my people who know me have no clue. They think of me as a silly plastic surgeon who goes home to his Newport Beach house. But the fact is, what I go home to is total chaos. And it's a really tough life that we live. I mean, outside I smile and act like everything's cool. But the fact is, I mean, it's a very, very hard lifestyle to live. It's brutal. So because of that, I work my ass off to try to, make things possible for my son and our community through drug discovery and research. And that's what we do through our foundation.
Okay. So that was sort of my next question was, so what are the biggest gaps between the medical
Yeah.
system and what KCNT1 families actually need? That's kind of what the foundation is focused on.
Yeah, I mean, our foundation. I mean, foundations come in a wide variety of flavors. Some are supportive, they just want to be there, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? They want to help their community adapt, and they want to, ours is laser focused on rapid development of drugs. And the truth is you can't just develop one drug. When I say drugs, I mean multiple drugs because you're probably aware 90% of every drug that gets developed fails before it goes, fails to get through clinical trials at some
Right.
point. And so I look at it it's a very simple math formula. You need 10 drugs to win. And so we will have to get 10 drugs into trials over the next 10 to 20 years to make this disease better.
Right.
So
And
there's a variety of ways you can do that. Anything from small molecules, which means pills, to gene editing, which is getting a tremendous amount of attention right now, to generic gene therapies like antisense oligonucleotides. There's a wide variety of strategies, and we have
right.
at least one program for every strategy. The truth is, we'll have two clinical trials that come out this year, one small molecule and one that's a drug that gets injected into the spinal cord, travels up to the brain, and works a little bit differently. But we've got probably 15 other programs in various stages of development so that we can go through failure until we finally find that right drug. If the first one hits, I'll close the foundation and celebrate, but history is not favorable. So we know that we're probably going to have to keep pushing for a while here.
Okay. I'm trying to recall. So the advances in therapies available right now are they're happening pretty quickly and they're pretty powerful, some of them with a lot of
Yeah.
potential, which is great. To do small molecule or pharmaceutical targeting, you really kind of have to have a pretty good grip on the mechanism, the
Yeah.
molecular mechanisms underlying why. And for our listeners, again, this particular mutation affects the potassium channel. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is effective and largely are there cardiac or
It's a good question. So
issues associated?
we've tried to map out where in the body this KCNT1 related protein lives. It's
Hmm.
predominantly the brain.
Okay.
But there are some signals, it's interesting how science work plays out, right? You can have a very well-respected institution publish one thing, and you can have an equally, well-known institution publish something else. So there are some conflicting data points out there about where else it exists. But the biggest concern is it in the heart, right? Because if you go and block a channel in the brain that suppresses seizures, but it causes a cardiac arrhythmia that can be fatal, you've got a
Right.
massive problem. So safety is at the core of all this drug discovery. And we have drugs right now that are very weakly effective for KCNT1, but they have a profound impact on the heart, so we don't use them.
Right. Okay.
The drug that's coming out this year, that's a small molecule is incredibly potent, which means it highly targets KCNT1, and it
Okay.
doesn't seem to have any cardiac manifestations. In fact, we have patients in Australia who are the adult safety volunteers on that drug now, and so far there's no evidence that we're seeing any problem. So we're very hopeful about that drug. But yeah, it's our options are small molecules. We've had several programs already fail. We've got a small molecule coming out this year, and there might be a follow-on small molecule the following year. And then the antisense oligonucleotide, the ASO, that's a drug that's currently about to start trials that comes out of France, and they're targeting 5 countries, and the US is one of those countries. So we've got 2 options that will go into kids this year, potentially a third, but we're finally at that phase where we've been doing work, and now we're in the trial side of things. So
Okay.
hopefully every year we'll continue to see maybe one trial come online while we
Right.
continue in the background to do more science,
Sure.
elucidate that question. But going back to your core question of the mechanism, the good news is for KCNT1, there's a really distinct mechanism and people understand it very clearly. So
Okay.
KCNT1, what happens in our kids is we get for most kids it's what's called a de novo mutation, right? So my child did not get this from me. He did not get it from my
Okay.
wife.
Spontaneous. Okay.
It's a spontaneous mutation that happened in his cellular division, right? So of the 6 billion letters in his genetic code, one of them changed. So for the audience, and you know this, all of us are full of mutations in our DNA. The vast majority of those do not matter because they happen in these non-coding sections, right? It's like if you have a recipe book and it's 1,000 pages, but only 20 of them have recipes, then it doesn't matter if you like tear out a bunch of pages in that recipe book, as long as you're not tearing out the actual parts that give you instructions to make the cake.
Right.
In Andrew's case, a piece of one of the pages that helps you bake one of the cakes is missing, or it got changed to the wrong. And so he has the wrong instruction. Well, 50% of his DNA is coding for the right channel, and 50% is now coding for this mutated channel. That mutated channel, what's happening in him is instead of going on, off, it is basically it's what he has what's called a gain of function mutation. So he's just letting out way too much potassium.
Okay.
So
So he's got
if you think about, I'm going to try to maybe make this look right
but
on
these are
camera.
oligomers, right? Or multimers.
Yeah.
So that's how you get a gain of function in an ion channel
Yeah.
is these different pieces come together to make a channel, and only one of
Yeah.
them needs to be wrong to make the channel stay open too much.
Yeah, so his is a tetramer, and so yeah, only one of those 4 subunits actually has to be mutated. And so what we can do is you either do a pore blocker where you put something in that pore so the potassium suddenly can't get out,
Right.
or you induce a conformational change. So you get a small molecule that binds somewhere on that protein, and as
Hmm.
long as you can make that channel stop functioning, in theory, you can restore normal function or at
Right.
least block seizures. So
Modulate,
we
right?
know from the preclinical work that we do in animal models that the seizures with this drug that I'm talking about, specifically the small molecule, go away really quickly
Oh,
and they
wow.
go away profoundly. So what they often look for in epilepsy to approve a new drug is at least a 50% seizure burden reduction. The drug that I'm talking about is far better than that.
Nice.
Now, that's in
Excellent.
animals, and it remains
Sure.
to be seen what will happen in humans. So the first question will be, does it do the same thing it does in our, animal models? And then to me, as with a child who's 8, whose voice I've never heard, the next question is, will that same drug also unlock development?
Right.
You
Yeah. Yeah.
know,
Can growth
so
happen
and that's
properly now?
the big, and then, there's different schools of thought on that. The interesting thing, I mean, I try to back away and think of it scientifically as being interesting and not this horrible disease that impacts my son, because it's the only way to get through your day and the only way to talk to your
Sure.
scientist. But one of the questions is, so you're right. So that protein, the KCNT1 protein, which is the Slack channel, part of it goes through the cell membrane, and that part makes the pore. Then there's this very long intracellular tail. And that tail of the KCNT1 protein interacts with some really critical other proteins
Hmm.
inside the cell, including FMRP, which is the Fragile X mental retardation protein. Fragile X is the #1 cause of mental retardation around the world. It's about 1 million cases. So, and our protein interacts with that. So the thought is that the diseases to some degree may be linked. Well, if you block the pore and you don't change the way our protein interacts, let's say with that protein, maybe you don't unlock development. But if you block the pore and the whole channel changes, like the
Right.
conformation or the shape changes so that it
Sure.
can't interact with those other proteins, maybe that's the key to development. And nobody knows. We will not know until we try this
Right.
in humans.
Right.
But we're hopeful.
And it's unique. KCNT1 is clearly specialized. It's very restricted in its tissue location as well as timing, right? Because, like you said, potassium channels are everywhere and they are so redundant, and there's so many different types and kinds at different times and different stages. But this one has an effect on certain pathways in the brain, and
Yeah.
we know the brain is incredibly plastic. So I mean, there's no reason to think that it couldn't start developing and regenerative or initial stuff. So that's exciting, but it's so hard to get something that's specific to one potassium channel because there's so many of them. They're so similar.
Yeah.
So that's very exciting that you have something that's specific to that one. That's
Yeah, I
something.
mean, this is, I mean, we don't have to get into, but I'll share this with you. It won't
We're
mean
already
much
in
to
the
most
weeds,
people.
Justin.
But so we have this drug is like picomolar potent, right? So, you've got micromolar potent drugs, which are very, like, we have a drug that we've used in our kids in trials that's micromolar potent for KCNT1, which means it's dirty, it's going to hit a ton of different potassium channels. And we've used it, other kids have used it, and you get some improvement in seizures, but it's a very potentially cardiotoxic. Then you get
Right.
into nanomolar, which is a pretty good drug, and then you get into picomolar, which is highly, highly potent. So this drug happens to be at like that level. It's a
Nice.
really
Excellent.
impressive drug.
Okay.
So yeah, so the odds are like this is instead of being like a skeleton key that hits a lot of channels, this one will work ideally on just one lock, right?
Right.
It just unlocks the front door and nothing else because you don't want your whole house open. You want to open just the right one. So
Right.
hopefully in this case, we're going to lock the wrong,
Okay.
the correct channel
Right.
and without having any untoward effects. So, and that's the phase we're at now. So our adult volunteers, I mean, thank God there's still people around the world who want to get paid to be in clinical trials, right? Because the FDA does not like putting drugs in kids until they've shown that they're safe in adults. So adults,
Right.
sign consents and say, "Hey, I'm willing to try it." And they've gone really well. And now what we need to do is see are they just as safe in kids because the physiology is different. But hopefully that will
Right.
prove out. And then
Okay.
beyond that, hopefully we see seizure control, and then ideally we see some sort of development return. So, we are hopeful about the development side. And you mentioned plasticity, and I've always, it's interesting when we talk to our neuroscientists, there's this broad range of people's assumptions about plasticity. So we've had some programs where they say, hey, we think you have to treat kids by age 2 or there's no point. That's a perspective. And then we have people who say, the models for KCNT1 show that the pathway development is not as disturbed as you might think, right? The neural network seems to be intact, which means if you might be able to just simply shut off the switch and
And
everything
you
is
can,
there and functioning
it's
the
wired,
right
just
way.
not functioning right.
Right. My argument against the age, there's a couple solid ways I think you can argue against the age 2. And that is you can have an 80-year-old man have a stroke, lose half of their, knock out half their
Right.
brain, and they can't walk. But with the right effort, PT and OT,
Yep.
a lot of them gain back functions that nobody is expecting to at a pretty advanced age, right? The
Right.
brain is pretty impressive what it can do under the right set of circumstances. And then in the
Not just
epilepsy,
restoring existing pathways either, but it'll make new pathways, right?
yeah,
If
exactly.
you
You
lose a
just have
limb,
to,
the part of the brain that controls that limb will find something else to work on and make new
yeah.
pathways.
So, and then within communities like ours, we've seen, there's diseases that are quite similar to Andrew's disease, where there's seizures and profound developmental stagnation, where 9-year-olds have gone on drug who have never spoken a word in their life, and 3 months into the trial with no actual training or effort,
Wow.
spontaneously said hello.
Wow. That's awesome.
Because a lot of these kids have receptive, like Andrew has receptive speech. He knows what we're saying to him. We'll give
Awesome.
him, I mean, we don't know what percent he understands, but there are
Right.
very clear things we say, hey, do this, and he does it, which means not only can he hear it, but he can coordinate the movement that's appropriate for it. What he can't do is express. What he does right now is he makes a series of sounds, and if you don't know him, you'll have no idea what it means. But my wife is like, the horse whisperer for Andrew. She knows whether it's, he's tired, he's hungry, he's got to poop, whatever the case may be. And I know them, but not as well because I tend to sort of be on the more like the treatment side, and she's more his care coordinator. Um, but he is, I believe that Andrew's locked in there. We just need to give him that opportunity to come out. I don't expect him to end up like my other two kids who are wildly precocious and will end up at Ivy League schools. But if I can get Andrew to communicate, some his basic needs and maybe take some steps, our lives look very different. I mean, I can't imagine a life where I'm 80, Andrew's now, 40, and I still haven't said a word to him. Like, I can't go to my grave without hearing my son's voice. And that's what drives me to wake up every day and not only do my plastic surgery job, but in all of my spare time work on my foundation and all the efforts that go into
Right.
making these things possible for him. So,
Before we get more into the foundational stuff, just on the other side of that therapeutic discovery stuff is, I think, the very promising gene editing. And if you can just fix it at
yeah,
that level, right, you don't have to know what the internal loop of the ion channel, the subdomain is doing and
yeah.
things like that. You can get it from a bigger, higher level more cleanly, I think, which is very exciting as well.
It is. And the challenge is like for Andrew's disease specifically, for KCNT1, there are 67 pathogenic variants. So, for your audience, it means there's 67 different ways you can get this disease. So if the protein's is big, you can have mutations in multiple locations along that. And so there are maybe three kids in the world who have Andrew's exact version of this disease. But
Okay.
then there's hundreds who have other versions of these other 67, 67 pathogenic variants. So if you're doing gene editing, like base editing or prime editing. So like we had a program that we started with David Liu at the Broad Institute. David Liu is Nobel Prize quality researcher, one of the best people known in the world for gene editing. And so I approached David with a cold email just saying, "Hey, here's who I am. This is our disease. Can you think about this?" And he offered, I mean, he's a gem of a human to do essentially without being paid to look into and do some early proof of concept work for us. And he showed that our disease is in fact amenable to base or prime editing. Um, the problem is, well, there's a bunch of problems. One is if you do that, you need a different guide for every different variant. So you can't,
Yep.
so we need to have one version of gene editing for Andrew and the two kids in the world who have his version. And then
Mhm.
we need 66 other versions made, and they'd all
Mhm.
have to ideally have like a target that they could bind to and treat. So it's a lot of different versions. So number one is you need a lot, this huge complement of different variants of that, let's call it a drug. But then we still have massive issues with like delivery and safety and toxicity. I felt really jealous a few years ago when another person in the rare community who was advocating on behalf of his family member got his family member a gene editing therapy way ahead of where we were. Now he had started sooner. And I thought, oh my gosh, look what they've done. And then within about 2 months, that child died.
Oh boy.
And we've seen several deaths. And you can get deaths with small molecules. We actually, and we'll get to it if you want to talk about, we actually had a very small N of one trial in our community that had some major consequences. But, so yes, unequivocally, editing is I think it's the goal for most of us. It's just that, we're still early phases with trying to figure out which viral vectors are safe, which are going to distribute best throughout the brain, what percentage of cells will actually get edited? Are we going to get
Sure.
3%, 5%? And can we target, KCNT1 isn't actually we say it's in the brain, but it's not even in the entire brain. It's in very specific regions.
Hmm.
So can we get penetration to those specific regions, and how much do you have to edit to see it, difference? So it's like the holy grail for sure. I mean, I would love to find a one and done therapy. But and I think that it will happen. I don't know if it's going to be Andrew's generation or, how many generations away, but we'll get there. And I have several friends in the rare disease space whose kids are now getting, gene products that they very much forced the development of or are responsible for getting into their children because of programs they initiated.
Right.
So for us, editing is sort of one of those things that we are funding it and we are supporting it and encouraging it in the
Right.
background and sort of waiting to see if bigger players can figure out the delivery and safety issue. But
Sure.
yes, it's fascinating science, and I mean, a durable result will be amazing. And the future, I think, will be this. So, right now, our kids get picked up, and get diagnosed. They'll have one seizure or 500. At some point, the doctor is smart enough to say, oh, we should test this kid for a genetic disorder, right? The sad truth is, all of these kids can get a genetic test after a single unprovoked seizure, and most do not for a wide variety of reasons. But genetic testing is massively underutilized, and
Right.
it's not a positive commentary on the neuro community that is the case, but it is unequivocally true. You have some old school doctors who are so far removed from medical school that genetics is just a mystery to them.
Right.
And their thought process is, well, most of these don't have cures. Well, that's true, but a lot of them do. And there's a lot of these diagnoses where there's not a drug for it, but we know for that specific disease that there are drugs you absolutely must avoid or you'll make it worse. So
Right.
genetic information, data is king in most things, and in particular medicine. So it's unfortunate how much resistance there is within the neuro community to get rapid gene testing. Um, but the future will be like KCNT1 specifically is going to be added several to this year to at least one newborn screening panel. And because we've got therapies, right, it makes sense to be on a newborn screening panel when you've got a therapeutic. So the paradigm in the future will be, hey, your kid was found to have this disease, and maybe you treat right away, or maybe you wait for that first seizure, and then boom, they go right into gene editing or right onto a small molecule, and they never see what my kid had to see, right?
Right.
So the future, I think, is very positive. I just don't know that version. I don't know how far we are from that version, but it's coming.
Okay. Okay. Well, this went really quickly. This is maybe one of my longest
Oh, wow.
episodes. I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Uh, I had more questions, but I think we'll have to wrap up. Justin, if someone listening wants to help, whether they're clinician, investor, or parent, what's the most meaningful next step for them? How can they reach out?
Donations are the single most important thing for an organization like ours. We really very much rely on friends, family, and quite frankly, total strangers to support us. All that money goes into paying our scientists, our bench scientists, and helping our drug discovery. So our website is kcnt1epilepsy.org. And at the top bar, there's a little link that you can hit, say, click here to donate or support. People donate in all kinds of ways, whether it's using a credit card, they'll link to their bank account. Some people make us part of their trust. And, so there's a lot of ways to do it. $20 helps, $100,000 helps. All of it is helpful, and all of it is very much appreciated. And, it's one of the most shocking thing to me I've found is how much support we get from people who never meet us. They hear the cause, it resonates with them in some capacity, and so we get almost more support overall from people who have never met us than we do from people who we're really close to. And it's a dark life to live. I mean, when you have a kid who's this ill, who you have to go downstairs every morning and wonder, has his life been taken by SUDEP? Has a seizure caused him not to breathe again? It's a hard way to live. It's a stressful way to live. I mean, we essentially run an ICU in our house, and we have these moments though that make it bearable. And when one of those powerful moments is when a total stranger says, "Hey, I heard about your story and I want to help," it has this profound impact. So it's always very much appreciated. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
Sorry about
That's
that crazy
that's
noise.
lovely. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Thank you very much, Dr. Justin West, for joining me today and sharing your insights and your life and dealing with creating such an impact on such devastating disorders. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Inspired by our guests? Visit phoenixprosperitypodcast.com/guest and join us on the show and share your success story with Tim. The spotlight awaits.